Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. So today we are going to talk about pincushions. There's some people out there that love to make and collect pincushions. They have tons of them. I've had this one for 8 years. This was given to me from a blogging friend for Christmas many years ago. Well, 8 years ago. You can't really see it for all these little pins I have in here, but I think this is maybe the shoe-fi block. It has a square here and then half square triangles here. I don't remember the actual name of it. And then she just kept bordering it almost log cabin style. Just kept putting borders on it until it was the right size. Now the back of it, this is wool. Now when she gave it to me all those years ago, she'd used scraps of fabric that she'd cut up and had left over from trimming quilts and stuff and stuffed it with the fabric. Now I kept it like that until probably I think last year, but it just made it in certain spots. It was so hard to get the pins to push in there. So I went ahead and I popped the seam where she'd stitched it together. And I just cut the seam open. I took all that stuffing out, which if you've ever stuffed anything, when you take it out, you have this little object and it's stuffed like this big. So I took all the stuffing out and I just restuffed it with some fiberfill. And I did a little ladder stitch and closed it up. But I thought today we'd go ahead and make some pincushions. I'm using the calculator strips where I showed you how to sew your scraps down onto it. Everyone's always looking for new projects to use it for, so we're going to use it to make some pincushions today. These are the plaid shirts from my son Robbie, and then just some fabric that I've used to make a pillowcase for him. I made my strip too long, so I used the leftovers just to make a small pincushion that I can take with me and use on when I travel. I don't travel, but if you traveled, you could. I travel from the craft room to the living room, and that's traveling enough for me. So go ahead and grab your supplies, and let's make some pincushions. So what I decided to do for my pincushion is I took a bunch of the scraps that were left over from my son Robbie's. I made him a plaid quilt out of his plaid shirts that he no longer fit into. So I took some of the scraps that I cut off from there. And I had a roll of 2 1/4. This paper is so old, it's really brittle. I found this in my closet. I've probably been carrying it around with me for many, many years. That's great. You ever see those wooden ones where you put this roll up like this and it comes down on this wooden thing and you write notes next to the phone? I think that's what I got this in plans of making, and I just never, that was, dealing with wood is just not my thing. So anyway, I have a 2 1/4 inch calculator roll and I have my scraps. So I went ahead and I stitched them down. I've already removed the paper. I'd had them stitched together and it ended up being like 11 inches long, and I decided that's just a little bit too long for a pincushion for me. So I just whacked them. I give myself about 6 inches and then about 4 1/2 or 6 1/2, 4 1/2, however it came out. I just went and said, okay, this one will be about 6 1/2, 6 3/4, because I was thinking about seam allowance, so it ended up maybe around 6 inches, and this is just whatever's left. So I'm going to have a larger one for my craft room and a smaller one for if I want to take it around the house or a travel pincushion maybe. So I've already removed my papers. I'll put a link up in the iCard on how to remove the paper from these calculator strips. And these shirts are from my 19-year-old son Robbie, who is living with all of his siblings. Oh, I have 3 kids. Robbie is 19, Miranda is 27, and Justin is 30. They're all renting a house together. So this pincushion is going to be here to remind me of Robbie. I'd also made him a pillowcase using this skull fabric, several years ago. So I thought, well, I'll just go ahead and use this because I love the bright colors. And since this strip is 2 1/4, I went ahead and cut these at 2 1/4. You can really make this any size you want. If your strips, let's say your strips like mine are 2 1/4, but you want it to only be 1 1/2 inches when it's finished sewing, you can cut it down to 2 inches. You can cut it down to 1 1/2, whatever you want. And you can make the side strips any size you want too. So I just thought, well, 2 1/4, 2 1/4, it sounds good to me, right? And since I'm dealing with scraps, I went ahead and I also made some backing. Now this is probably, I cut it to go this way on the short one. It's probably not going to be exact size. I'll just trim it down. I'm just dealing with scraps here, so I can make my pincushion and keep making it smaller any size I want. It's not like I'm saying I have to have a 6-inch pincushion, And I did the same thing here. So I have these two, and then I just, once again, these were scraps. I do have yardage of this, but I decided I'm just going to use my scraps. It's just a pincushion, and on the bottom you're not going to see it. So I kind of found wherever, I just decided where they kind of look good together and stitched them together. And that'll be the back for this one. So what I'm going to do, just like any block, I'm going to take these 3 pieces and sew them together. I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam here and here. And then the same thing here, and then I'm going to press them open. And I'm going to bring them back and I'll show them to you. And there you go. These tops are done. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim them up just so it makes it easier when I go to put my back on. Then I have nice even sides. I went ahead and I pressed them to these side ones just because of all these seams here. It'll lay nice and flat that way. You can go for an exact size, squares, whatever you need. Apparently mine's going to be 4 1/4 wide, so I'm just going to go with that number. And it is going to be, I'm going to trim this up to be 5 1/4 wide. It's really going to be whatever you want. You know, size, when it comes to a pincushion, size is, it doesn't really matter. It's a personal choice, whatever you'd like it to be. What I can do is I can line up one of these numbered lines right here along my stitching line to just even up the side. That way I have a better chance of it being a little bit even-ish, depending on how well I stitched my seams. When it comes to a project like this, it's just a quick little project for my craft room. I do always want to do my best, but at the same time, I'm not going to be ripping out the seams if it's off by a little bit. I'd rather just kind of trim it up and make it so it's even. And if it's a pillowcase. It's a pin cushion, and once I stuff it, it's probably going to get a little bit out of shape anyway. And since they don't have to be very accurate, this is a really good first-time sewing project. You can color coordinate. You can have it for holidays. If you could always put, like, let's say we could put Halloween on this side. And if you make the back, then you can make the back of it for Thanksgiving. And then you'll have a dual-purpose pincushion. You just flip it over based on the season. Okay, now I'm just going to take this and I'm going to find the spot. Obviously, I've made it a lot larger than I need. So I'll just pick a place that I like. I kind of like these bright neon green skulls, so I think I'll put it over here to make sure I have that. I have right sides facing, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch all the way around, but I'm going to leave a little bit of a space for turning. And I find that it's easier to leave it on this solid fabric than it would be on where you have your calculator strip in there with all these piece scraps. Plus, it's a lot easier to put it on a long side than it is on the short side because you just have more room on each side. Because I'd have to put it in this section here in order to stay away from these seams, so when I hand stitch it together later, it'll be easier. So you could put a couple pins in it if you'd like. And for this guy, I think I'll try to get that pink skull down there. I just lay him on here. Now, as you see, this one was larger than my top, and for this one, the top is larger than the backing. So what I will do is I'll just be really careful and kind of pay attention to where I'm going. What I can easily do is just take it like this. Say I lay this on here, spin this around, and I can just trim off this little excess that's sticking out. And that'll make it easier for me when I'm stitching around it. So I won't miss any of my seams as I'm cutting, as I'm sewing. Now if you want, you can make it exact. You can take it right now and trim this piece off here. Now you get the start of a crumb block. Or a log cabin, actually. And now you know you have it the exact size. So you can go ahead and stitch around. And once again, leave just enough room for turning. And remember, we're going to have to stuff it. So whatever you're using to stuff it, you need to be able to get it in that hole. So don't make it too small. I'm going to take these both over to the machine and stitch around them. And I'll be right back. Okay, this one's all stitched around, and this one still needs to be trimmed up, so I'm just going to go ahead and take either my scissors, or it's a lot quicker just to take my rotary cutter, line it up with the top of my pincushion. Once again, large enough to save for scrap piles. What I like to do is I keep a basket near my sewing machine, and as I'm having pieces like this, or if I'm cutting yardage and I have a big chunk left over, smaller than a fat quarter, I like to just keep it in a basket, and then when that basket gets full, then I just go ahead and I go through, and if I try to put it in there neatly so I don't have to re-iron the fabric, but I iron it as necessary, and then I go ahead and cut it up and put it into my different scrap bins. If I want to cut them into strips or squares, or if it's large enough and I just want to fold it up and put it into one of my containers that I keep the larger pieces. Okay, now anything you're going to be turning around with corners, if you go ahead and trim the corners just a little bit, it reduces the bulk, and it makes it easier, and you get better corners when you turn it around. So I just kind of go at an angle. You can just chop off straight across at the angle, about 1/8 of an inch from the seam from where you stitched it, but I kind of like to angle it a little this way and a little this way, and it just takes those extra little bits off. So if I just cut diagonally there, and then I just come back and give it another little diagonal shave there. And I'll do that on all 4 corners. Let's see if you can see this. Yes, I think you can. When I started stitching, instead of just starting right here and back stitching, I started off at the edge and I came into my 1/4 inch, and then I pivoted and went this way. I read once on a blog that if you do this, it makes turning the seam under after you flip it around easier when you go to hand stitch it. And for the most part, I think I agree with them. So then I stitched all the way around, and then when I got back to this side, instead of back stitching, I just stitched off the edge. Now that's going to keep it just like if you back stitch, so you're not going to have that, you're not going to be able to pull this seam open as easily. And then this automatically forces this bit here to fold under when you go to stitch it together. So now if you have a piece, you can use little hemostats if you want to put it in there. Say if you can't get your fingers in the hole. I'm always torn between how big to make the hole. I want to make it big enough that it's easy to turn and stuff, but I also want to make it small enough that I don't have a giant 6-inch opening to hand stitch up at the end. So you just grab it, gently pull it through. You don't want to tear anything, but since we did that, start off at the fabric and we did those little angles there, it kind of helps it make it easier to turn. And with this larger one, I should be able to just stick my fingers in there. Oh, see, I didn't pay attention and I didn't look at my back. I still ended up with a seam right there that I'm going to have to deal with. I guess it really didn't matter because of the way I made my backing. Oh well, lesson learned, right? Once again, it's just going to be a pincushion, so it'll be okay. I could always go back through and trim a little bit off of the seam on the edge there. Then I take a non-sharp item. I have a plastic crochet hook that's a little rounded here. Find my opening. There it is. And I just use it, I run it along the seams and I pop my corners out. I've tried doing this before with scissors and stuff like those brave people do, but I end up poking out my corners and I have a hole that I have to fix. If you do happen to run, like say you're using a sharp knitting needle or a pencil or scissors or whatever, just go ahead and flip it back out and just make your seam shorter, you know, make your pincushion a little narrower. You'll just have to redo this seam. Just restitch it and it'll cover up the hole. See how this automatically just wants to fold right in there and it's not sticking out? So it's a really good little trick. It makes it nice and even, because a lot of times when you're doing this part, you can see on a project where it's kind of tucked in a little bit. So maybe they've rolled it down a little too far, but this way I can take this over to my iron if I want, and I can give this a good press or just a finger press, and it just closes up so nicely. I do like it to run it across my crochet hook across these seams in case it's folded under at all. It's got any little bit of a kink in there or whatever. It'll just pop it right back up to the surface. Now since I'm going to be stuffing these, I won't press them. Just nice little finger press there is good for me. See how nice that looks? Looks a little crooked here just because of the way I put my fabric on the strip. But when you turn it over, it looks really nice. I'm just going to stuff mine with simple polyfill. You could stuff it with those little pellets to put in the bottom to make it a little heavier and then put your polyfill stuffing. You can use wool stuffing. You can use old batting. You can use fabric scraps if you want, but I suggest you make sure that you cut them really small and fine because it does get a little hard to put your pin through several layers of the fabric. Some people used crushed walnut shells. You can go to the pet store and get like it's called lizard litter. It's just crushed up walnut shells and stuff that you sell in a bag, and it's a lot cheaper to buy it that way than if you buy actual crushed walnut shells. The only consideration with that is if you're giving this or selling it to someone who has a nut allergy, you could really give them, you can have an allergic reaction from having those crushed walnut shells in there. I don't mind. Mine doesn't really slide around on the table. I don't know, it's when I'm sticking my pin in it, it's just right there. I don't have a problem with that. You could put some coins in there. You can put some pennies. You can put some marbles in the bottom. Those flat bottom ones you can get it in the craft section. You could put some aquarium sand in aquarium rocks in the bottom. You can put some sand in it, and then just finish it off with your polyfill, and that'll give it a bit of a weight, and it won't slide around in your table. But I like mine with just plain stuffing, and I'm fine with that. I keep mine in a little gallon-sized bag. When I was making the stuffed crocheted amigurumi stuffed animal toys, I would buy a big giant box of it. I guess it's like 5-pound box or something like that. But when you open the box, it explodes and it like quadruples in size. So I would just take out handfuls and stick them in a Ziploc bag. That way I wasn't constantly going into that box. Now the thing with this is when you're stuffing something, you don't want to just grab like all of this and just jam it in there. And you can see how this has got little balls of it and stuff. So you want to just kind of take it and loosen it up a little bit. And then when you stuff whatever you're stuffing, it'll make it smoother. And you won't get all those lumps. It's not as important with a pincushion, but if you were stuffing the legs of a doll or something like that, I just take it and I just kind of push it down into that corner. I like to fill the bottom two corners first. If I were stuffing a toy, I would definitely use half of this, if not less than that. And this is the thing, how big did you make your hole? It would be easier to stuff if I made my hole bigger, but I'd rather struggle a little here than have to stitch a long opening closed. I've gotten better with the ladder stitch over the years, but I do have a bit of a fuss with it, and sometimes I just don't want to do that much. But I think this time I definitely went a little bit too short. So I'm going to go ahead and stuff both of these, and then I'll show you what they look like. If you didn't have any of this spatting, this stuffing stuff that you wanted to put in your pincushions, you could use cotton balls. Just make sure you shred them apart a little bit and loosen them up because they tend to be really tight before you go and stuff them in here. Now, as I'm looking through my bag, I realize that I have some polyester stuffing in it, and I also have some cotton. It's personal preference which one you use. If you want to be more natural, you can go ahead and get the cotton ones. This is more of the polyester is a long-lasting hardcore thing, but the cotton ones, like if you're stuffing a toy, it's going to give you a better fill and a better feel to it, but it's a pincushion, so whichever one works. Now, one of the things I do is, even with my stuffed animals, I've learned that if you take them when you're done and you just kind of rub them between your hands and kind of pat them and squish them down a little, it'll move that stuffing around no matter what you're using, and it'll fill into the empty spots, and then you can see if it's got enough in there. Now, I don't like my pincushions super tight, so this one's fine, but one of the things you'll notice is when you think you've put enough in there, you could probably go ahead and take some more and more will fit. There always seems to be a channel the way I stuff them. I always seem to have a channel right down the center that I can easily add more stuffing to. Don't overstuff too much because we will need to have a little bit of room here in order to hand stitch this closed. Now, if you're doing a bigger project or you're having a hard time holding this, you can put like a pin through here. You might want to use a safety pin because it's going to be springing around a lot and you're probably going to stab yourself in the finger with the end of the pin. But I usually just kind of hold it like this. I roll it down. And that way I can get to stitching it. This guy, I put all cotton in him. He's nice and squishy, and I'm probably going to put a little bit more in because I can put my finger all the way through to here, and there's still more room. I just stuffed him with cotton just because he's small, and I thought, well, let me see what I'll stuff him with cotton instead of having a mixture. I think he's nice and good. Now, this one's, like I said, it'll be good to, if you're doing EPP hand stitching or your hand quilting or whatever, it's nice to have just something to put a couple pins in to have next to you. You don't need to have your full entire pin cushion full of your 40 or 50 pins. You can just have a couple or just even just one. When I'm doing the hand embroidery, I like to have a pin cushion near me just to rest my pin in when I'm done. I don't always like to stick it in my fabric. All right, let me get my supplies and I'll show you how we're going to close this up. I'm using some red thread in hopes that you'll be able to actually see it when I'm stitching. When I'm stitching clothes, something like a child's toy that they're going to play with or something for my dog or cat, I like to double strand my thread. I just pull an extra long length, twice of what I think I need, and I put the two ends together and I tie a knot in the end. Just your regular one where you just wrap it around your finger and then I roll it and then you've got a knot. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, it just has to make sure it's going to not pull through your fabric. Now, I don't know if it has to do with the fact that I'm right-handed or it's just the way I think, but I like to go from right to left when I'm stitching it down. Now, you can do the whip stitch where you're just going in and out and in and out and you're wrapping your thread around the outside. When you buy something from like Walmart or whatever, stuffed toy or something, you'll see how that's how they close it. But I like to do the ladder stitch, and it kind of pulls it all together and it keeps your thread hidden. We'll see how well I can do it if my red thread doesn't show. So I just take my needle and I go inside and into the seam right next to where my hole starts. I'm just going to pop up so that I'm coming through right at the very beginning where the last couple stitches are. See that? Doesn't have to be super precise, but I just like to, I don't want to be starting way over here and I don't want to have a gap. So I'm just going to go ahead and bury my knot in there. And when you're doing the ladder stitch, you're going to take a little bit from here and a little bit from here, and then a little bit from here and a little bit from here. And we're going to stay inside the seam allowance. So if you've gone ahead and pressed it with your iron or with your fingers, you'll have a crease that goes right along where that seam goes from stitch to stitch. And since we started on the end and put it in instead of back stitching, it kind of makes that really simple to know exactly where that 1/4 inch seam is, or whatever seam you happen to use. When you're doing something that's stuffed like this, it makes it a little harder because you do have all this that you're going against and you're trying to hold it closed, and all this batting, the stuffing wants to just burst out on you. So it's similar to doing when you're stitching your binding to the back of a quilt. I'm just going to come into the seam allowance close to the top, and I'm just going to take a little bit of a bite. Can you see that? Just a little bit of a bite at that fabric, and I'm going to pull my thread through. Now, I don't need to pull it super tight. If you use some thread heaven or some beeswax, it might make it easier and you don't have to worry about things tangling up. Then I'm going to come directly across so that I have, wherever this stitch came out, I'm going to come on this side and put it directly across where that stitch come out. So I'm going to have a stitch on this side and directly across a stitch on this side. So it's going to be like the rungs of a ladder, is why they call it the ladder stitch. Now I don't need to pull this super tight. You want to, you think, well, I need to have my stitches tight, but we can stitch a few before we make it tighter, and it'll just make it easier for us to stitch. So you're going to skip a little bit here, about a stitch length, and when you're going through, make sure you're not going all the way through to the outside. If you're using a matching thread, any little oops and mistakes like that will be hidden. See, now if I pull on this, it'll tighten it right up, but I don't want to tighten it up yet. With such a small opening like this, we can do the whole thing without worrying about tightening it up. So once again, I'm going to come over here just below my fold line. It's definitely hard to show something like this when you have your fingers in the middle of everything and you can't see it. And I'll come back over here, and I'm coming across that seam right there. So I'm just taking a little bit from each side of the seam so that the actual stitch line, the seam here, is centered in the middle of the stitch I just took. Come back over here. Now just keep going back and forth from side to side. See how you can see like the rungs of a ladder right there? I'll go ahead and whip stitch my little one just so you can see what that looks like. This is the preferred method if you want your stitches to disappear. Okay, so I've reached the end, and what I'll do is I'll just pull on all of these. Now this one, you can see that little red stitch. I came up a little higher than I should have. But that closes up my hole. Now if you don't like the way it is, you can just go ahead and go back through again. Tighten it all up. Or you just take it right here. I just grab a little bit of this fabric. I make my knot. Run my needle back through this loop. Because I'm using the double strand, I gotta go a little bit slow because it likes to get tangled. Just poke it back in the seam and come out somewhere on the side. Pull it a little, and then when I trim it, that end just pops right back into my pincushion. And there you go. Now you can take it, roughen it back up. Now you're going to do a much better job when you're not trying to struggle in front of a camera. But as you can see, I mean, obviously you can use a little bit of work there. In all honesty, what I'll probably do is I'll probably pop that off, cut it open, and I'll restitch it, and then I'll show you how I can actually do it the right way. Yep, it bothers me. Now for this one, we're going to do the whip stitch. So we're going to also just stick our needle into the end here, just past where our seam was. If you don't want to do any hand sewing at all, you can get that little seam tape that you put on here, put the two together, iron it, and you'll be all set. You could use some fabric glue to hold it together. Now to whip stitch it, this is the easiest. If you use matching thread, it won't show up, but we're just going to take, now I've gone from the back side to the front. Now my threaded needle came out on this side. I'm going to go right over, and I'm always going to go from the same side. And I'm just going to whip that closed. You see how my thread will lay on the top there? So that makes it a very visible seam. I kind of like to turn it on its side and just go from the bottom to top all the time. Now you want to keep your stitches relatively close together because you don't want whatever you put in there to come out. Now if you put in the walnut shells, I don't know how they are. I think they're pretty small and powdery sometimes. So you need to make sure that you close this up well so that it doesn't come leaking out on you while you're using it. So you just carry on, stay close to the top. Right about this time, I'm thinking, gosh, I made this hole way too big because look at all the stitching I got to do. You could also take this to your sewing machine. If you can get this extra bulk off out of the way, you can just go ahead and stitch it with your sewing machine. I've seen them do that commercially on the pillows you put on your couch, the throw pillows. Okay, I'm at the end. So once again, I'm just going to take a little bite in the same spot, run my needle up through the loop, pull my knot tight, tuck it back through to the inside and pull it out aside somewhere. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and pick this open because, like I said, it is bothering me and I'm going to try to do a better job. It takes a little bit of practice for me to get the ladder stitch just right, and I like it to look nice and smooth. It's a little bit better. You can see this is the leftover knot from when I tied it off last time, and this is where it is from this time. But I don't have any of the strange puckers, and most of it's closed up really nice. Now, if you use matching thread, if I'd used a gray through here, then you wouldn't have really seen anything. So now I have a place to put my pins. I can go ahead and load these up with whatever I want in them. I've used up a little bit more of my scraps for the calculator strips, and I've used scraps for the sides and the back. Use some leftover stuffing, and I'm all good. Now, that's another scrappy project all done. You have plenty of time to make these for Christmas gifts if you want to use them as little stocking stuffers. If you just need some for your craft room yourself, you're all set then. I think little pincushions like this make great gifts. So if you have some crafty friends that you'd like to swap little gifts for at the holidays, you can go ahead and make something like this. If you were to use matching thread here, this one wouldn't show up as much. You can feel it with your finger, but overall I think it's alright. It's really not as bad. Like I said, with matching thread it wouldn't be all that bad. So do you like your pincushions to be nice and stuffed full, or do you like to have them a little squishy like I do? Go ahead and let me know in the comments, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye!